My name is Jim McClellan, and on behalf of the SSGN, we offer a very warm welcome for those joining us this evening. Before starting, please permit me to just say a few quick words about SSGN and who we are. We're essentially an organization grounded in the tradition of the 10 spirituality and sustainability conferences held in Assisi in Rome that was based upon the vision of Thomas Berry. We're also based upon the other pillars of the Earth Charter and Pope Francis' wonderful work, Laudato Si, and indigenous spiritual traditions. So through networking and education, our goal is the personal transformation of consciousness in the service of healing the earth. So with those brief words, I'd like to again welcome you and also welcome my colleague, Ensign, who will say a few brief words about our speaker. Ensign, can I turn it over to you?
Thanks so much, Jim. We are certainly delighted to have Professor Tim Van Meter with us this evening. I met him in 2018 in Assisi in a conference that was in the tradition of Thomas Berry and students and that as it started, and was a wonderful place to gain information and acquaintancy with people such as Professor Van Meter. He started in the early 90s as an environmental impact planner for an engineering firm. And then he started reading such people as Thomas Berry, Wes Jackson, Thomas Merton, and Rachel Carson. And that certainly invigorated his interest and ultimately his calling about the environment. And especially from a regenerative agriculture standpoint and other sustainable justice aspects of how civilization and the world today operates. And one of the very striking things that he did at his university, which is Methodist Theological School of Ohio in Delaware, Ohio, was to say, we spend a lot of time and effort raising grass, as many of us do in our lawns, and yet that is not ecologically solid. And why don't we start an organic farm, which really was transformational for the university and even for the community. So I welcome today Professor Tim Van Meter to tell us about regeneration, not just in agriculture, but in society. Tim, take it away.
All right, Ensign, thank you. Thank you so much. And it's good to see folks here. And it's good to see a couple of my favorite humans from MTSO here, Samuel and Gia. They're really wonderful people, and it's good to see them. And then Art, Ensign, Jim, Natasha, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak about this. And I'm gonna share at kind of the edge of where my thinking is right now, not necessarily from prepared. It's prepared text and all that, but it really is the edge of what I'm thinking about right now around what it means to cultivate regenerative vision and regenerative possibility for our shared future. And for me, that begins with the idea of knowing where we are right now in the world. And we are in a time of expanded conspiracy. Let's put it that way. That there's a whole lot of folks believing that there are exceptional forces working against them in ways that they're as beyond their understanding, and they move into a frame of conspiracy. And this isn't just a conservative or an evangelical space. This is across the political and religious understandings, progressive, liberal, conservative understandings. We all at times have to be careful about how we engage this idea of conspiracy, because we feel as if we're in the midst of changes we can't handle. But there's part of that word I want to reclaim, and that's to conspire. And the root of that word is to breathe together, to be at our core close enough, heads together, sharing breath, developing a vision of a new way of being. And for me, that's a regenerative vision. So how we think together, we're so close in as we begin to share new stories, new possibilities, new vision, that we are using this word conspire in a way that builds possibility and builds vision and builds kind of a regenerative engagement with the world. Now, we know the idea that conspiracy itself can lead to a victim mentality, a poor understanding of any kind of religious text, and I want to avoid that. But at the heart of what it means to be Christian, and that's something I still claim and still somewhat claims me more than I claim, but it's a problem. It's a more and more problematic understanding of what it means. That word is highly problematic to me. And as I mentioned earlier, I often tell my students that what it means to be Christian in North America is so deeply colonized that it's a word we need to be careful about how we think about it and how we use it. But to conspire together, to think together, to retrieve from our religious traditions something of deep value as we go forward. This is where I'm playing around with what it would mean. So to breathe together so close in conversation, we want to whisper together about a new possibility of being in the world. That's the quote I wrote down for myself. And then in some ways, this is influenced by Howard Thurman and some of the other thinkers of the late 20th century that I've been teaching around these things. William Stringfellow, Howard Thurman, the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh. That what does it mean to kind of construct a way of being in the world that holds a radical difference and radical possibility at the heart of it as we're thinking together. Howard Thurman, the gentleman I just mentioned, who was a late 20th century scholar, activist, mystic, talked in his book, Search for Common Ground, about the need for human beings to find common ground in order to stand against our own extinction. I think those words written in the 70s are still incredibly powerful for us today. And so I want to talk about what we have at our heart is a need for radical change. And for myself and for this idea of breathing, for me, it begins in soil. When we think about regenerative vision and regenerative, it comes from this understanding regenerative agriculture for me. That's the founding, the grounding. And to be regenerative with agriculture begins with not what we produce, but the health we bring to all around us, the soil, our fellow creatures, our fellow human communities, in all of those ways that how we think together begins for me in soil, which is living, breathing entity. Within the Torah, the Christian texts, the grounding texts of three of the great religions, in Genesis, it's spoken of the Creator breathing life into soil, and that's the foundations for all of us. And if you were to read the text out of the out of the Common English Bible, it speaks about breathing life into living soil. And so that all that life we're around, that the soil itself is alive. And we know on a properly, soil has basically been left alone for centuries, or is now being managed in a regenerative organic way. There's more life in a teaspoon of soil than we find on the face of the earth. It's just in that space. It is there. So I want to talk about what it means to have a conversion towards life and a conversion towards the soil, and more than just worrying about how our food is produced, which is something we need to worry significantly about. And I'm fully on board with buying from local folks who are doing the work in a very careful, regenerative way. I think we need to begin to think about overall this kind of regenerative vision in a way that begins with the soil, begins with our food, begins with the possibilities of us living in different and healthy ways in small, resilient communities, and in now spaces, recreating narratives. And I don't know that we'll ever be at a time where a grand narrative will sustain us, whether it be the one of the Christian colonizers, or it's the one of the different peoples around the world that have lived with a massive cosmovision, massive worldview. Those days may return, but I think more likely what we are to live into is these kind of smaller stories within our local context. And that's what I'm thinking about when I talk about regenerative vision. The communities build these things together. So I want to, with you all, I want to think about Ensign and I have had these conversations. I don't want to put him on point or anything, but I'm thinking about some of the conversations we've had about your own conversion. What brought you into this idea of an ecological space and an ecological vision? And I think those possibilities are shared by all of us. At some point in our lives, we heard something in the midst of the possibility of transformation that made us take a radical shift. And my hope is that we are at a time of small radical shifts. But I also want to say that I'm not a big believer in the catalyzing moment. That the last hurricane to hit Florida will make everybody begin to think about climate change. It hasn't had any effect at all on Ron DeSantis and those kind of things. But what happens is a small group of people get together and begin to think about how they're going to respond with resilience and possibility and passion and engagement. I've drifted a little bit from my own outline, so I'm going to stare at it for a second and pull myself back. So as I said, the regenerative agriculture involves increasing soil life and fertility without relying on artificial inputs. And that for me is the kind of that element at the grounding of regenerative vision, that it is occurring around us all the time, and we begin to live in ways that allow what is occurring in the world as it exists without our inputs to begin to influence us toward a deeper way of being. Ensign mentioned what we're doing on our campus with our CSA, with our organic farm, with the dining hall that has 85% local, humane, organic. Many folks in this room have heard me present on that multiple times. It's getting a bit boring, and I understand that. I have folks who make fun of me for just repeating that over and over again. But for me, it becomes a grounding metaphor. But there's a larger grounding metaphor about what it means to be generative community. And it's beyond just food, and it's beyond food sovereignty. It's beyond, it's the revisioning of what it means to be people of faith, regardless of our traditions. So my life primarily exists in the Midwest, the flyover country, the spaces that get a lot of derision and at times have earned it. Maybe both Ohio and where I'm sitting right now, Indiana, and my sister's place, has earned the derision of November and now is reaping that reward. But I think that it's important for us, particularly those of us who live in this particular area of the country, in the Midwest, to begin to understand that there's going to be a deeper call on us going forward. So it's not just enough to have local farms, local farmers, resilient community, healthy soils. All those things are really important. We have to have a healthy sense of hospitality, because the Midwest in North America, from northern Indiana up through Minnesota and all the way over to the Finger Lakes, is repeatedly named in the studies by climate scientists as the place that has the possibility of the deepest resilience going forward for life. While other parts of North America are underwater, in drought, under wildfire, the Great Lakes region has a space that might open up and has the possibility of deeper regeneration. So when I present some of these thoughts in churches, my first challenge to them is around food, but my second challenge is around welcoming the stranger. I believe how we welcome immigrants and how we welcome refugees is at the heart of what it means to conspire together and to create a new story and to stop the lies of the larger state that begins to tell us that the stranger is a thief, the stranger is someone we can't trust, the stranger is someone that we have to hold with contempt and with disregard. And I think one of the stories we have to begin to tell at the heart of our faith traditions was there all along. And that is the Middle Eastern understanding of the stranger comes to us as if they are the Holy One, as if they are the ones who are to be welcomed most in our midst because they bear the image of God, the image of the holy into our space. And so part of what this means to construct a regenerative vision, in my understanding, is to begin the practice of transformative hospitality. Hospitalities that welcome those who have been named as outside of, as less than, as not welcome, have to become the center of welcome for resilient and regenerative communities that have at their heart faith and faith traditions, whether they be Christian, whether they be Buddhist, Muslim, in all the ways that we are at the heart of our traditions are spaces for welcoming strangers. And we have to begin to rename ourselves in ways where the welcome of the stranger is at the heart of what we do and to present to them the possibility of healthy and good life together in resilient community. There is at the heart of this is the idea that when you welcome the stranger, when we welcome the stranger, we are ourselves transformed. And we are transformed into a space that allows us to deepen our engagement with our own faith traditions. And I want to say that a text of shame has worked. It's good to see you, CJ. Just teasing. So this second space first is this movement towards good food, then the movement towards the welcoming of the stranger, and then at the heart of this for me, and I want to answer questions because this is me working through things, not me giving you a finished narrative. But when we think of the role of our communities of faith, our spaces, our temples, our churches, our synagogues, as places of profound welcome for those who have been left out or have been named as less than by our larger national narratives. I think we have to include in a special kind of welcome or a special sense of engagement or even a transformation of how we understand education and possibility are people younger than ourselves, are what we always talk about youth and young people. That in that we have to begin to stop asking the question, how do we invite them into our spaces? But begin to ask ourselves, how do we live in long-term loving relationship across generations? How do we allow ourselves to be influenced in what we understand, where the voices of young people who multiple times in the last decade have been named in surveys as having no hope for the future? How do we begin to construct with them, to develop with them, conspiring closely, whispering together, sharing breath, new narratives that offer possibilities of a new regenerative future together, where young people can begin to imagine themselves in their eldership, transferring and engaging folks across generations. And I think this is another space where we have been misled or maybe even abused by practices that I'm deeply engaged in. You know, I'm engaged in food and land, I'm engaged in church and faith, and I'm engaged in education. And so much of what we understand as education is transfer from those who know to those who don't know. And we've had Paulo Freire and other models for what it means to have a liberative model of education. But I think that within our faith communities, within our institutions, all too often, myself included, we understand ourselves to be the ones who have the ways of knowing. And we do have knowledge. I don't want to ignore that in any way. Paulo Freire did not ignore that. He understood the importance of having folks at the center of education that have knowledge while welcoming everyone's knowledge into that space. But I think that more importantly, rather than what we know, it's again the stories we tell. So how do we engage young people and in ways in long-term relationship where we begin to all together reframe the stories of who we are in this world? Reframe stories that allow us to think about the earth not as something that produces for us, but as a community of health that we all live in together. How do we think about faith as the space, faith communities as spaces that perform and engage radical hospitality at the very heart of who they are, and not spaces that determine who they are by who is in and who is out. And I think even more importantly, in my own engagement with young people, which is more and more limited the older I get, but I still have some informants in the spaces that I need informants to let me know what life is about when I've lost touch completely. More importantly, that is to not continually inform young people how deep the shit is that we're standing in, but to invite them into ways to reimagine the space in their future as a possibility of deep creative engagement around resilience, around passion, around possibilities, without sugarcoating how deep the shit is we stand in, but allowing young people to name it for themselves in a way that invites deeper conversation. I want to suggest that we might begin to conspire with young people in ways that open up their lives and their vision and their stories, rather than trying to find ways to convince them of our arguments. And how do we do that together? And I think SSGN has strong possibilities for that, that there is at the heart of this just the possibility of modeling interreligious conversation around sustainability and intergenerational vision for that is at the heart of the vision and mission of this group. And I believe it can go even deeper as you engage the young people in your own life. One of my, I would say, informants is my great niece. Actually, I tell her she's an okay niece, but she's my sister's grandchild, so I have to give her the title great. But she is in many ways completely removed from this conversation, has no desire to think about this in any way, and is in a high school situation, which is considered one of the better high schools in the state, but her education has completely alienated her from her own imagination. And she has no possibility at this moment of imagining anything more than what she said last night or a couple nights ago. What's the next good thing I get to do? What's the next good thing? And this is not a child lost in despair. It's just what we've given her as far as imaginative possibilities of her engaging her life. Survive high school. We use the phrase together when we're talking that high school life is about surviving, to just survive and advance, which is a phrase, those of you who follow sports, that is stolen from the NCAA basketball tournament or any soccer tournament. All you can do is survive and advance. I think that's a pretty pretty dismal way to think about your own life in adolescence. But I think that that's the spaces that we've often given young people as we choose schools as the best place to warehouse them, as opposed to the best place to engage and deepen their imagination. So I want to go back to what I said at the beginning, and then I want to open up to just conversation. You can push me on some things. That what I think I'm talking about when it begins to engage a larger regenerative vision begins in this space of conspiring together, of sharing breath, of speaking in low voices so close together that we begin to reimagine a world together. We begin to retell stories in ways that allow us to go forward towards a possible radically transformed future. And I want to say this in a way that this is a direct challenge to much of what we do around ecology and sustainability, which is to try to repair what we have. And I believe we have hit a point, and if this administration has convinced us of nothing else, we've hit a point where, as a species or as a North American US culture, we are more committed to our own demise aligned with the demise of others than we are to our own possibility of all thriving together. And rather than trying to spend too much more energy repairing a system that can never be repaired, I think it's time to begin to think together in small, engaged, transformative, resilient communities to imagine spaces where we can allow each other to thrive in the midst of empire, in the midst of the collapse of empire. And I think the death throes of empire are going to make life significantly more difficult and almost impossible for my friends and colleagues of color, for women, for LGBTQ individuals, all the folks who are named as less than or named as outside of the love of the white supremacist God. And so this is one of the spaces, one of the reasons I'm glad to speak with folks who gather with SSGN is I think you're in the midst of doing this reimagination. And I think the possibilities that are being reimagined here have can be incredibly important for communities of people trying to reimagine their spaces and their possibilities. So I didn't want to say a whole lot about climate and climate change, but we know that climate change is a force multiplier. It multiplies the crises that we're in the midst of in every way. So if we have a government and individuals in power that are naming people outside of the of economic, political, social, health care, the possibilities that those people will suffer more extensively and more deeply under the changing climate. And if we think about the idea of conspiring or revisioning a sustainable future, I think those that are naming everybody from positions of power and from their fragile, not even, I think it's an insult to say that these are immature or adolescent rich guys, adolescent billionaires, which I've seen in a couple of things. I think that's an insult to adolescence. That it's these guys are sociopaths, and rather than trying to reform a sociopathic, psychopathic culture that has determined this is what people in power should be and have been named that by a majority, we begin to say, who are our people? where are the spaces we can gather with our people, and we can begin to make some type of transformative change for the people that we are closest to and desire to live life more deeply with. And from that, develop the stories that allow us to begin to name a radically different world together. So I've mentioned to folks that part of what I have found in my own teaching over the last decade is I find a lot more hope and a lot more possibility from engaging the poets and the artists who are trying to reimagine a new world, and to allow them to inform my own vision of the world, whether it be Joy Harjo or Mary Oliver or Louise Erdrich or Tanya Candiani as a ecofeminist artist out of Mexico, Andy Goldsworthy, a number of folks that do that, and let their narratives begin to shape the narratives that I tell alongside the people that I'm in relationship with. I don't have grand conclusions, and I spend a whole lot of my time living in fear of the future because it seems so dark. But I come back to a couple of core quotes. One's the Thurman quote I shared earlier about the need for common ground in order to stave off our own extinction. The other is a Rebecca Solnit quote that I probably used every time I've talked with this group. I apologize, you're tired of it. But she talks that it is a time of darkness, but it might be the darkness of the grave, or it might be the darkness of the womb. And I want to work in such a way with people alongside that allow us to begin to revision what might be being born without external to the collapsing empire, and let the empire die and stop trying to find ways to heal the empire and begin to find ways to heal ourselves and to heal the earth and to live alongside the health of fellow creatures. So that's really where my thinking stands right now. I offered about a half my outline, but it's so many different directions that I just want to come back to see if you all have any questions or pushback or thoughts, or if you want to bury this recording to make sure that it never sees the light of day. Thanks you all for the chance to do this and to have this conversation, Jim and Ensign and Art and Joe and all the friends, Fidelis, other friends on this call. Good to see you all. Lee, good to see you all. I already gave Cesar a hard time. I'd like to give him more hard time, but that'll happen over a beer sometime in Zoom.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. So this is now the fun part starts. Well, not that the beginning wasn't fun, but we can engage in a conversation. And so I'd like to ask Natasha to open it up to everyone and invite people to share with us their thoughts.
Tim, I'm going to jump in just for a second and say, it seems to me, we just, in a spiritual book reading group, got done with a long, many-month reading of Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet by Thich Nhat Hanh. And you referenced Thich earlier, or Tay as they call him, a teacher. And we're now reading Living Buddha, Living Christ, which is, comparative. And what Buddhism seems to be all about, at least as I understand it, is transforming oneself, regenerating oneself first, and being in a position to be present in a compassionate way for what's your community. And your community is whoever they believe in interbeing. Like, we're not separate beings. We're all interconnected, which a lot of us, I think, philosophically belong. And I think that's what you're pointing to. How do we get in that, if you will? I don't want to label it exclusively Buddhist, because I think it's very much Christian as well, that we're all related. We're all family. We're all in the community. and start behaving that way. And as you say, not worrying too much about, well, can we fix the empire? Or can we reform that or whatever, but actually making our own communities. And I love what you pointed to. So thank you.
Thanks. And I find Thich Nhat Hanh's engaged Buddhism incredibly important in thinking about this. I've also had arguments with Buddhist friends about how part of ecology requires non-attachment and letting it all go. And I'm not quite in that space. And I'm glad that Thich Nhat Hanh was not in that space either, as far as I can read. Yeah.
No, I think Thich was very much an engaged activist, action-oriented Buddhist. Yes, but out of a very mindfulness, very compassionate base. So I think, and I think the multicultural perspective is very helpful to moving or thinking about the regenerative future, frankly. As opposed to the colonization, which you've referenced.
Yeah, and part of that, I think he wrote a letter to Dr. King that allowed Dr. King to begin to think about opposing the Vietnam War, which King found very significant around what your people are doing to my people. And there's power there from the very beginning about how to revision a world that's important. So yeah, I honestly don't think we can do it without any religion, by leaving any religious tradition out. That has long-term engagement with the holy. I think one of the strengths that SSGN can claim and some of the conversation in the CC can claim is that to be particularly and intentionally interreligious and welcoming each other in that. The other thing if we ever get back to a CC, one thing I'd also like to do is to drop the academic vision of a conference there and begin to have more spaces around tables for conversation, because that's where I find real power. Not that academic engagement's not important. I do it. It's my life. But my gosh, if I could have 4 hours to sit down and talk with our colleagues from McGill that are doing the incredible work with the UN, and to sit down and have the conversation with Beth, who will once again, who repeatedly calls us back to a larger vision of what faith can mean and all those things. I would welcome that so much, to have the spaces for these kind of possibilities. And I think the interreligious narratives that we tell each other can be at the heart of revisioning our space together.
Tim, I was really identifying with your comment about the life in the soil. And, Dr. Suzuki, whom we know has done great work, and whose videos I used to use in my classes, really developed in me a different and new and greater understanding of the meaning of life in the soil. That so much more life in the soil than that we're not even aware of, and we just take for granted. It's fantastic. You're so close to it with your agriculture. I mean, it must be terrific for you to be able to bring that point home so often, because it's so clear.
On days it is. On days it's also the most frustrating place to be on the planet, because I could see it being so much better. But I think it was a couple of years ago now, Ratan Lal, who's one of the most rewarded soil scientists in the world. I mean, he's won the Science Medal of Japan, the Science Medal all over Europe, and is retired from the faculty at Ohio State. He's spoken on our campus a couple times. He's a Hindu, practices Hinduism, but he's just an incredible scientist. He said in our space that the soil is the only place in the universe you can witness resurrection.
Interesting.
Where death comes to life again and again, year after year in season.
That's the life in the soil. Boy, beautiful.
Absolutely.
Apropos of conversations, which is what we call our series here that you're speaking on, what do you think the potential is for convening conversations to help develop regenerative communities? It seems to me that that's when we get to know each other and have respect and caring when we're in communion and conversation. And while we don't love Zoom, it's better than nothing, and it can promote community, at least to start.
Yeah, and I think that the possibility exists in the CC conferences for those to continue on. I think that, but I also think that I think part of it's just knowing your neighbors
Mm.
and knowing who lives around you and having. I mean, I hate to come back to this, but one of the primary really good things that happened out of COVID were the number of conversations I had with neighbors that we were in radically different places, even around our understanding of the disease. But we began to have some conversations about what it meant to be neighbors and what it meant to kind of walk by each other's spaces. So in that, and Ensign, I mean, folks in this room, maybe several folks know this as well as anybody. I'm a hermit. I'm talking about building community, and I am at my core a hermit. I have my monk's cell that I live in. It's called an RV trailer for the most of the year. And you know, when I travel, I have conversations with folks across difference. And when you're in campgrounds, you tend to meet a lot of folks who are in a very politically different position that I hold in those spaces. Rick Cluxton and I camped together the last few years up at Lake Superior, and I'm going back this year, and Rick's coming back this year. And most of our neighbors would not even know what we're talking about. But within those spaces, when I have conversations with them, they do have they have kernels of faith that are sometimes different than I am. But when I refuse to rise to whatever bait they're throwing out there to try to get into an argument and try to engage them around a deeper, so somebody says something like, well, do you believe in gay marriage? And I say, well, do you have people in your family that are same gender loving? Well, yeah. Well, yeah. So how do you treat them? How do you respect them? How do you engage them? My belief is that committed love in all forms should be celebrated. And that people ought to be celebrated as they seek to be together and to build some kind of resilience. So knowing your neighbors doesn't, and I would say what I'm trying to say is knowing your neighbors doesn't mean arguing with them. It is that search for common ground. It is that attempt to try to find a space where we can hold a conversation around, do we both love our children? For me, very often is, do we all love dogs? That's the initial thing the conversation comes from. Do we all like good food? I have folks who in the farming community will argue with me that we'd never be able to feed the world with the vision that, you know, I'm promoting with some of the colleagues around OFA and others about feed, but that we can. But rather than engaging whether or not that we can feed the world, is, do you enjoy feeding people? What's your, you know, I'll ask a farmer, so what's your debt load to maintain the amount of inputs you have to put into your land? Do that. And what would it mean for some of your neighbors who have gone to a different form of organic grain growing as opposed to traditional grain growing? What are their inputs? How is that different? And to talk about what they know in such a way to where they can inform me. But I think that part of this begins to know your neighbors. And if you find out your neighbors are survivalists and they can't wait to shoot your ass, then find new neighbors. You know, I think more than anything, what this space is teaching me since November, and particularly since January 20th, is we had better know who our people are that we can turn to in this time. Who are folks that we can trust in this time? And how do we build those spaces of community? And for me, many of those people are neighbors that I met during tougher times, but in some spaces, it's the students, it's our community on campus, it's our farm team, but we all have those spaces in our lives. Who do you turn to when the hurricane's heading to Florida? Who are the people you trust to check on your spaces and your properties? But I also think these larger conversations that y'all are hosting have the possibility of being seeds for the types of communities we all desire. Um, uh, some of the work that Joe Holland has done around intentional community and the spaces for that, I think is absolutely essential to revisioning what we're going to do is how do we live together. My challenge, once again, is that I'm a hermit. And if I'm going to live in an intentional community, it's going to have to be on 100 acres and most of the communities on one corner and I'm on the exact opposite side. That's the way I can live an intentional community, but I'm trying to do better.
I think you're exaggerating, but there we go.
Hey Tim, I'm with you. Give me another little plot of land somewhere, right, where I can read and write. But just want to say hello and you know, it's always good to see you and thank you for your words. And hello to everyone too, all my friends at SSGN, Dr. Holland. Hi.
Cesar, good to see you.
And this is my colleague Portia. We both teach here at St. Mary's College here in California. And you know, we just again are love the nuggets of wisdom that you're dropping here, and you know, the quote about the womb and the darkness, and you know, it can either be the darkness of the grave. That's a lot to ponder there, and I love it, right?
Yeah.
And you know, just wanted to say thank you for your words and for sharing it in a way that's raw, as you're saying, right? Not necessarily tied up with academic jargon or lingo that we are all used to trafficking in. And so, you know, just thank you and lots to ponder and lots to take back, especially as we engage our undergrads.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us tonight. And Portia, I'm sorry. Wish I would have met you without forcing, you know, shame on CJ first. But you know, it's good to thank you for joining us.
And it's nice to meet you, and I loved listening in, even though it was a little piece. But I look forward to talking more in the future because there's a lot here I'd love to say more about. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Yeah.
Tim, I'd like to ask you a question about people who may be coming from what seems like a radically different vector perspective. And I think that one of the things is they're unhappy too. They just don't know how to get it, maybe except by being destructive force or dissembling force. And I think that's because we don't have a common vision or even a relatively common vision of how to really be in community that's spiritually satisfying. When I say spiritual, I mean not only true spirituality that may be beyond the realm of the ordinary, but spiritually in terms of spirit between humans.
Yeah. No, I think that's accurate. I'm angry with my neighbors in Ohio and Indiana, but I don't think they're wrong in feeling the alienation they feel. I think that their diagnosis of where it comes from is wrong. I think that folks have been taught to never question empire, never question capitalism, and to understand. I mean, I'm trying to think of who said it. I can't remember who said it. That you know, this has been an engine of our culture for quite some time is to blame someone further down the economic social ladder in order to feel better about your place in it, even though you're feeling your own alienation. And so I think their diagnosis is completely wrong, but I don't think their anger and alienation is wrong. I think that they're naming their reality in a way that that very often they've been offered spiritual pablum, you know, spiritual baby food for how to take care of their own situation from our organized churches, United Methodism that I'm affiliated with most closely, uh, as well as any others that you to treat. And so as they're living in their space, um, individuals, con men and con women who bring in certainty as opposed to the kind of questing that a real spiritual life, I think, requires, the deep questioning, I think, give a sense of relief and a sense of power for folks who have a radically wrong diagnosis of their own situation, which is an arrogant thing for me to say. And I understand that it's arrogant. But I do think continually entering the economic, the political, the social sphere in ways that undercut your own possibilities for thriving and not just your neighbors um, is an example of a wrong diagnosis of what is happening in your life. I saw Donald's hand.
Thank you, Tim. This has been a wonderful conversation. Really thankful for so many of the things that you've put forward. I'm loving it so much, especially when you started going into reimagination and revisioning ways in which we can have this conversation. It's been part of what I have been trying to do for quite some time myself as I engage with people. But I like the radical form of which you are placing it to us. And I want to take it from what CJ was saying there and continue on that level. I've always loved the book of Genesis and all of its wonder. Just think about the very beginning and how, going back to the very beginning, how it's so simple that out of that womb experience, that darkness, comes some possibility, And those who sat together and put the book of Genesis have given us a treasure, probably one of the best treasures that we can hold on to. And this is where I always want the conversations to go, because there are actually societies, indigenous societies, that live it and continue to give us an opening to flourish in that way, So there are people who are reimagining these conversations in different ways. There are architectural designs that are coming up, and they're designing a whole new future.
Yeah.
And it's happening. It's happening in the sciences. It's happening. It's a bigger conversation in other fields. But I think it's a troubling conversation once it goes into politics and how we try to live. So I love the fact that it's a conversation amongst us who care for where we live. How can we revision it in such a way that can be really edifying for all of us? I love the point of interreligious. So which we can pick from a lot of this conversation and just go to the basics, which is the beginning. Just think about your childhood wonder, the excitement of having to create something and not knowing the endless possibilities that this creation can bring.
Yeah.
And to guard it in such a way that you can pass it on to generations and generations to come. For me, it is a special wonder. So I'm so grateful that you were able to draw our attention to such reimagination. So on that note, we can pick from so many societies around us, okay? A lot of the time, it looks like when the conversation starts, we go to the intellectual part, the might and the right and the formations of society that has come with power and all of that. And I like that too, because I'm a student of Joe Holland, but I like it from below, from the Aristotelian point, power from below, and seeing us at that level of, just let's start again. Let's reimagine it from below, from those who are not able to follow us on those lines of logic, of power, of empires and all of that. But those who want to preserve, those who want to guard, and those who suffer, who are left out, So Tim, that's my level of reimagination. We can go on those levels. I think that the conversation too can take a new dimension, can take an enriching dimension. We can really learn from suffering. We can learn from lack of opportunities. We can learn from the withdrawal effect. And I can go on and on and on to show so many ways in which that speaks directly to what is countercultural for us at this moment in time. Thank you for reimagination. And I thank the others And of
Uh,
course, Joe and my other colleagues, and Edson,
Yeah.
Jim, and many more. So
Yeah.
thank you for the levels of reimagination. And if we can go on those lines, I'm
Yeah.
with you.
Well, and thank you, Donald. And you've sparked a couple thoughts. So I have a colleague who's retired now, Ted Hebert, who wrote a book called The Yahwist's Landscape. And he and I had about Genesis. And he's the one who did the translation of the Common English Bible that talks about from the living soil, God created them. And Ted, in conversation, once said, we have to remember that the Genesis, the Torah, arose out of when women began to till the land in such a way that people were sustained and had the freedom to begin to tell stories around the fire. And the narratives around the fire began to look at the holy in a different way than, in his understanding, hunters gatherers could do together. And then the other conversation, I think we had a work around kind of anti-racism diversity training here 8 years ago. We're not supposed to use those words in the academy here in the US since January 20th, but I still use them. And the person who presented for us was a really wonderful scholar from Denison, Dr. King, is her name too. She said that too often these conversations end at people who hold the power trying to figure out how to invite people to the table they've already created, as opposed to inviting people to rebuild a table together where the conversation and the power might be shared in a radically different way, because the table will take shape with a multitude of voices in ways that were never existed before. So part of this idea that I mentioned, radical hospitality, I think is rebuilding that table in such a way that allows everybody to come to it. The larger political colleague yesterday who was preaching in our chapel said, there's a lot of folks who are nervous and said politics should never be a part of the church. But let's be honest in this space. Politics have now been imposed upon the church. Politics have been imposed upon communities of faith. Let's figure out together how we're going to respond in those places. But I think that maybe the response begins in this table conversation. Let's rebuild what it means to be talking together in an interreligious vision. And for my mind, if your table does not include people that are incredibly different than yourself, then it's not a healthy table. It's not a healthy space. Thank you, Donald. I appreciate that. Thinking together.
Well, before we wrap up, does
Mm.
anyone else have something else to add?
Amanda, were you raising? Oh, great. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm getting sick, so actually I don't know if I'll be able to share. Yeah, never mind. Okay, maybe as I speak. So I teach fourth grade, and it's, I don't know, cold and flu season, so you can hear it in my voice.
Yes.
So thank you, so much for bringing in the idea or just the concept of caring for our neighbor, showing respect. I just wanted to share a little about my day. So today we had parent teacher conferences, and this is my first year as a teacher, and dealing with parents was something that I was actually
Oh,
most worried about. And then I realized that we don't deal with them enough. I wish we got to know parents more. I wish we got to know families more. And just today, I had a conversation, the second conversation this year, well, the school year, with a mom. So most of my kids are from immigrant families, either from like different countries in Africa or from Dominican Republic. And one of those moms, so I'm from Costa Rica, so I can have the conversations in Spanish. And sorry about my voice. And one of the moms, I told her, my goal for these conferences are to get them to read books, to get the children to read. And one of the moms was telling me, oh, it's hard for me to ask him what he's reading about because he speaks English now and I don't speak English and he's losing his Spanish. So that I don't know, I think I'm feeling sad about that situation. It happened with my brother too. He never learned Spanish, and so like my people from Latin America who are coming here, we're dealing with this problem that I don't think we're talking about enough, which is that we're losing that connection, which we've lost a lot of our roots because of colonialism. And now, right now, we're losing that connection to our grandparents and to our parents, even like in the same household. We have family members that can't talk to each other because the children are only learning English and the parents are getting by without learning English. I guess because they don't have time because they're working all the time. So yeah, so as a teacher right now, I'm preparing to teach them geometry tomorrow. But I'm glad we have these spaces because really what I want them to get from me this year, is just like what's essential about also about being human, you know?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm sorry that you're living in a petri dish because of
Yeah.
Thank you.
Joe.
Joe, you're muted.
I always forget to unmute. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm sitting in a more comfortable chair, but the microphone's a bit far away. Yeah, thanks so much, Tim. It was beautiful, beautiful to listen to you. It could be my morning meditation. But I was thinking of all the people who vote for Trump, you know, ordinary people. There was a book I finished reading lately. It's called Strong Man on the dictators. You're probably familiar with it. But she has a quote in there from the fellow who ran in Turkey to be the mayor of Istanbul. I don't know if you remember the story. They had a campaign and had a campaign booklet everybody had to study, and it was called Radical Love. And you were never supposed to mention the name of the dictator, but you're always supposed to love the people who follow him. You know, that very positive attitude toward the people who, because, and I was saying they followed him because it's the only story they know. My wife Paquita and I, after I retired, we moved from Miami over to where I had family in Venice, Florida. The center of Venice is very wealthy. We couldn't afford to live there. We lived with the working class, and it was very interesting. The neighborhood had Confederate flags flying all over. Most of the people there were not from Florida; they're from Alabama and Georgia, even from Tennessee, and they come down to work in construction in Florida because there was no work up in their home states. And I built a little cottage on our property to be like a study. And so I had to get a lot of guys in to help me with different things, and inspectors would come, and I would talk with all of them. And I realized that nobody from our world ever talks with them. They never meet. They would say to me, I never met a professor before, you know. And,
Yeah.
no one ever talks to them, ever, 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 from who we think would have the right discourse, so to speak, or at least even to listen to them. They really have. They talk about Democratic Party abandoning the working class. I mean, I think it's much deeper than that. All the institutional mainline churches, including the Catholic Church, has really, by and large, abandoned ordinary people, and the educational system too. And they were very, very open to conversation. They had lots of wisdom, lots to say, and this was in about 2016 when Reagan was running, and almost every one of them, and they were mostly males because they were doing craft, tradesman work. They would always say, "Well, who do you think I can vote for?" He says, "I could vote for Trump, or I could vote for Sanders. Which one should I vote for?" They really saw that the establishment was bankrupt in the middle, and they could go to the left or the right. But really, there was nobody from the left around to talk to them, but there were lots of people around from the right to talk to them. And for a long time, since the Goldwater campaign, the right wing has invested in a grassroots populist strategy, and it's paid off. And the rest of us have been busy living in our, kind of affluent bubbles, and not realizing how deep the alienation of ordinary people is. So I think what you're doing, traveling around the country and
talking with people is a wonderful start to healing that, Tim. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, and Joe, our friend Rick Clugston is a master at this. He can join in conversation with anybody. I've kind of been watching him in these spaces, and he's just a genius. He's a genius in many ways, but he's a genius in this space too. So he's really does some. He's able to meet people exactly where they are. So I'm learning from him too. Yeah. But I also have to say, for me, I want to say my boundary is in these conversations, and I'll tell people in these conversations, when they begin to speak about the diminishing of people based on whatever, I stop the conversation.
Yeah.
And just say, I can't go there with you. I'm not going to go there with you. If you want to talk about these other things, we can continue to have conversation. But if you're going to begin to vilify people I love in the LGBT community or vilify people I love around race and racism, we can't have this conversation. So I do set some pretty firm boundaries. I won't listen to everything.
You know, all the people I dealt with were Southerners, you know, and I never once heard anything like that from these folks.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
maybe something about the Southern culture.
yeah. I think the North is more racist, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
in my own
I don't want
experience.
to say it that way, but yeah. It's there is a kind of I don't know, strong sense of community and kindness, especially kindness. I think is a big thing in the Southern culture. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I do want to say also to Donald, I'm probably going to write this in an article and I'll take all the life out of it because I will have to rely on academic language.
We welcome it, though. We're looking forward to it.
Yes.
Thanks again.
It will be wonderful.
Tim.
It will be an excellent read, Tim. I look
Okay.
forward to it.
Okay, thank you.
Well, good. If anyone else has a comment, we welcome it at this time. If not, we have filled up our space of time pretty well with a wonderful conversation, and I'm hoping that we can invite Tim back again sometime soon, and we look forward to sharing our upcoming programs with you. And so because we really want to continue this dialogue together at such a critically important time. Now, I'm going to say we're going to be sending out 3 items this week, hopefully in the next few days or early next week. Natasha will be sending out a recording link for this conversation so that you can connect to our YouTube channel, in which we have many podcasts and conversations programs now. The second thing we'll be sending out is our newsletter, which is now, thanks to Joe and Amanda's hard work, is now taking a format of a flip book magazine, which I think you'll find very cool. And also in a few days, we'll be sending out our journal. The journal has more in-depth essays and papers and book reviews. And of course, we're interested in the arts, whether it's poetry or photography or other items, and we're very interested in trying to highlight that as well. And so please consider contributing to the magazine and journal. And I'm very excited to send it out to you on behalf of Joe and Amanda very shortly.
Thanks,
So,
Tim. And to
Thank
all,
you all. Thank you all.
namaste.
You,
Peace.
Tim. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks,
Peace.
Tim. Wonderful.